Global markets have their worst start to a year on record. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese visits war-torn Ukraine, and auction clearance rates take a dive ahead of an expected interest rate hike tomorrow. It's Monday, the 4th of July, 2022. Welcome to Fear and Greed, Australia's most popular business podcast. I'm Michael Thompson, and welcome back, Sean Aylmer.
Thank you, Michael. I'm delighted to be back, and on the 4th of July as well. It suits because I was in Hawaii last week with a couple of the kids, had a fantastic time, and I tell you what, that is an island that's buzzing again. There's been lots of talk of the post-COVID recovery in the US. Certainly Hawaii was as busy as I've ever experienced it.
Hey, that's impressive actually, isn't it? Because it's nice to see that tourism is clearly going strong, and your flight appeared on time yesterday. And this is a little bit of a confession that you know how I enjoy the flight tracking apps. And
yes, you do. Big fan.
might have stalked your flight for most of it.
Did you?
It's that final descent in. I was like, oh, Sean's back. Everything is right with the world. Look, there's been plenty happen in the last week. I'll tell you what, you chose a cracking week to go. Obviously, end of the financial year. We've had Albo over in Madrid for NATO. There has been plenty happening, and we've got a really good interview coming up after the show. It is with Tim Lawless from CoreLogic, one of our favourites. He's talking about the slump in house prices and kind of why we're shifting away from auctions, which is something that we're going to be talking about in this episode as well. But the main story today is all about the year so far in global markets. Adam and I spoke about the ordinary result on the local bourse, down 10.2% for the financial year, but globally, the story is even worse for the first 6 months of 2022.
That's right. 10% for the local bourse is actually a really good effort if you look at the other major markets around the world. The US stock market recorded its worst first half year of trading in more than 50 years. On Friday, the S&P 500 closed out the half down more than 16% for the last 6 months. Quite incredible. The Nasdaq posted its biggest ever losses over the same period. It's not much better in Europe. In the UK, recession fears drove the FTSE 100 to its worst month since the early days of the pandemic. But if you want to get an overall picture of just how bad it is right now, take a look at the MSCI World Equity Index, widely used as a global benchmark. The index has lost more than 20% in the last 6 months, with $13 trillion US dollars, that's with a T, trillion US dollars, wiped off world stocks since the start of the year.
So, Sean, is it mostly due to inflation and then obviously subsequent kind of rising interest rates?
Yeah, certainly around the tech sector and some of those growth stocks, that's what it's all about. But you can add in the war in Ukraine, you can add in sky-high energy prices, collapsing business and consumer confidence. There's still COVID-related closures in different parts of the world, notably China, and momentum is against equities. Put all that together, that's why you end up with the MSCI going down 20%. One sector hit particularly hard is the tech stocks. We mentioned that. The tech-heavy Nasdaq, it's lost $5.4 trillion US dollars in value since the start of this year. But the sell-off has been reasonably broad in the US. According to the New York Times, stocks considered bellwethers like Apple, Disney and Target have all fallen more than the overall market.
And what about bonds?
They haven't had a good 6 months either. One index tracking the 10-year Treasury rate in the US showed a 10% fall in price. Analysts at Deutsche Bank had to go back to the late 1700s to find a worse first half-year performance for equivalent bonds. Bonds are, of course, particularly sensitive to long-term economic conditions, factoring in inflation and interest rates, so it may not be good news for the future. The problem for investors is that when equities struggle, bonds are supposed to provide a safe haven, and that just hasn't happened.
All right, I'm going to ask you probably the impossible question to answer, but is the second half of the year going to be any better than the first?
Who knows? I mean, there's a case for positive and there's a case for negative. Now, it got off to a slightly better start with the S&P 500 gaining more than 1% on the weekend. The Nasdaq showed similar gains, but in the US, the Federal Reserve is determined to put brakes on inflation, with Fed Chair Jerome Powell saying last week he wouldn't let the economy slip into a high inflation regime, even if it meant putting economic growth at risk. Now, that means more interest rate rises. But if he can somehow control the slowdown in the US economy, then you will find equity markets picking up again. That is the great unknown, whether or not the US Federal Reserve can engineer a soft landing or whether we end up with a hard landing.
All right. And how about local markets? What's been happening?
Well, investors hoping for a brighter start to the new financial year were disappointed, with the S&P ASX 200 closing down 0.4% on Friday to 6,540 points. The energy and materials sectors were the worst performers. The biggest decline came from lithium group Liontown Resources, down 5% or a bit over that. Woodside Energy was next, down 4.4%. The best performers on the ASX 200 on Friday were biotech Mesoblast, up 11.5%, and buy now, pay later group Zip, up 9%. But my favourite story was about WA shipbuilder Austal, which won a contract to build vessels for the US Coast Guard. Its share price jumped 25%. Great story.
Not a bad day for Austal. And Sean, anything else to mention on international markets?
Well, we've covered Wall Street already. It's closed tonight for the 4th of July, of course. The Aussie dollar is sitting at 2-year lows, around 68.1 US cents, pulled down by the recent drop in commodity prices. Gold is trading around 1,813 US dollars an ounce, and oil is around 108 US dollars a barrel. The ordinary run for cryptocurrencies continues, with Bitcoin still well below the 20,000 US dollar mark. On Friday, one crypto broker suspended trading, deposits and withdrawals after a cryptocurrency hedge fund filed for bankruptcy protection in New York earlier in the week. We're going to hear a lot about cryptocurrencies in the next few weeks, and I'm not sure much of it will be good news.
All right, big start. You have come back firing. We'll be back in a moment with the rest of the day's business news. Sean, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has visited war-torn Ukraine, meeting with leaders and touring cities in the Kyiv region. It's really an important show of solidarity with Ukraine, and the Kyiv governor wrote online last night that Mr. Albanese was amazed by what he saw, including the destruction of homes, the destruction of an airport, that kind of thing. I'm sure that we will be hearing a lot more about this visit over the next day or two. But Sean, I'd also be interested in your take on everything that preceded the visit to Ukraine, because the Prime Minister has had a week of meetings with the world leaders at NATO, then a visit to France for a sit-down with President Emmanuel Macron. Would you say that part of the trip was a success?
I'd say so, especially if you look at the video the Prime Minister posted on social media over the weekend. Footage of him meeting and hugging Emmanuel Macron, posing for photos with their partners, and just to really stick the boot into former Prime Minister Scott Morrison, delivering a speech where he declared trust, respect and honesty matters. Of course it does. So I'd say they've mended the damage over the Axe submarine contract, although the $830 million settlement to the sub manufacturer probably helped too. As for NATO, well, Australia stood up on the world stage. The Prime Minister met with a lot of world leaders, united in condemning Russia over Ukraine and in declaring China a threat for the very first time. But Mr. Albanese really got under the skin of Beijing when he said China should distance itself from Russia, learn lessons from the Ukraine invasion and consider what it means for its own ambitions for Taiwan. Beijing called him ill-informed for that one. Then on Friday, China warned that we were involved in risky and provocative behaviour by flying an Australian surveillance plane in the South China Sea a few weeks back. A spokesman for China's Ministry of National Defence said those who come uninvited shall bear the consequences. I think things are getting back to normal, Michael, really, and Australia-China relations.
Yeah, sounds a little bit frosty, doesn't it? But if it does make you feel any better, I think he said the same thing to Canada as well. So we're not alone in that.
Well, this is one of the things about China. It's not like it's picking on, or Beijing's not picking on Australia. Beijing's picking on everyone. Yeah. So there are literally dozens of countries who probably would argue that their relationship with Beijing at the moment is at a low point, and Australia just being one of those.
Yeah, which I suppose makes it so significant that NATO took that step last week in declaring that China is a threat for the first time.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
All right, now back home again, Sean, and auction clearance rates have fallen to their lowest level in more than 2 years. It's not a good sign for the housing market, especially after last week's CoreLogic data showed another slump in house prices.
That's right. CoreLogic recorded a 55% preliminary clearance rate across the capital cities on the weekend. That's the weakest result since April 2020, when we were just heading into lockdowns. In Sydney, the clearance rate was just 52.5%, which might be under 50% once all results are in. Melbourne's preliminary clearance rate was under 57% from 628 auctions, down from about 1,000 a week ago. And more sellers withdrew homes from auctions as well. Across the country, 300 properties were pulled before they could go under the hammer. The highest clearance rate in the country was Adelaide at 71%. Not surprising, really, because according to last week's CoreLogic data, Adelaide's the only capital city where prices still rose at more than 1% in June. Across the country, house prices fell 0.6% last month.
Yeah, and make sure you stick around for our interview with Tim Lawless from CoreLogic coming up after this, where he goes through all of those stats. Meanwhile, Sean, the Reserve Bank Board meets tomorrow, and expectations are growing for another jumbo hike in interest rates.
Yeah, they sure are. Reuters surveyed 33 economists, Michael, and all but one of them expected the official cash rate to go to 1.35% tomorrow. That's another 50 basis point rise. We had 50 basis points last month, and then we had 30 basis points the month before. That is a significant hike in rates. $7.5 million mortgage over 25 years. Put all those together, and you're kind of up in that $600 or $700 extra a month range. So we're all paying a lot more for our home loans.
Yeah, it's a decent whack to the cost of living, isn't it? And imagine, though, if they've surveyed 33 economists and 32 say it's going to be a 50 basis point. Imagine if you're that one left and you've gone out on a limb and said something else, and then imagine you're right. Wouldn't you just look like Nostradamus?
There's been a few people over the years. Bill Evans has done it. Shane Oliver's done it. Roy Robertson, a guy who was with BT back then, did it. And they just picked a different rate cut to everyone else and got it right. And they made their name on it, really.
Oh, fantastic. All right. Now, Sean, New South Wales residents are being warned that flooding rains could stick around until tomorrow. Yesterday saw some pretty dramatic scenes around Sydney with flood rescues and evacuation orders in place.
Sydney and areas up and down the coast have copped an absolute drenching over the last few days. An east coast low has set in, with some areas receiving more than the average rainfall for the full month in just one day. Warragamba Dam spilled earlier than expected, with dozens of people rescued and thousands subject to evacuation orders. Sadly, the floodwaters have already claimed at least one life after a man drowned when his boat capsized in the Parramatta River yesterday afternoon.
Sean, Australia's set to pass a pretty grim milestone in the pandemic this week, our 10,000th death from COVID-19.
7,677 people have died from COVID so far this year. 1,344 passed away last year, and 909 lives were lost in the first year of the pandemic. Together, it means we'll likely pass 10,000 deaths in the next few days, and at the current rate, could record 14,000 deaths in just 2022. Authorities are bracing for a surge in case numbers as we enter a third wave of Omicron, with renewed calls for people to get their vaccination boosters. Queensland has the lowest uptake rate for a third dose at just 63%. Western Australia is the best at 83%. Meanwhile, foreign citizens visiting Australia will no longer have to declare their vaccination status. The changes come into effect from this Wednesday and is based on medical advice. Passengers on inbound international flights will still need to wear masks.
Sean, the timing for your return to Fear and Greed is perfect, because there is a story about probably what you did yesterday. When you came back into the country, did you do the digital passenger declaration?
The stress. So we got to the airport a little later than we planned to. I didn't realise you needed a digital passenger declaration. I was with my two of my children. So the three of us sat outside the Honolulu airport on the iPhone, going through, filling in all the information. It took us maybe 20 minutes. It wasn't a seamless process either. I had to go back and try and find where I was up to. It was just, and you're never sure the Wi-Fi is great. Disaster. Anyway, apparently it's not popular though. So I'm going to add my voice to that. Now, the app was launched in February, and it hasn't had good reviews, and I know why. It's very buggy. So yesterday, the government announced that from Wednesday, it won't be a requirement to fill it out digitally until such time as they can make it more user-friendly. Didn't help me over the weekend, Michael, but, self-interest. Anyway, looks like we're back to searching for a pen as you're coming into land.
But isn't it funny? Sometimes the old school way is still the best, just until they get it nice and smooth for you.
Exactly.
Now, just briefly, Sean, there was some sad news yesterday about the death of Victorian MP Jane Garrett from breast cancer.
That's right, Michael. A state funeral has been offered to her family. Ms. Garrett was diagnosed with breast cancer in 2016 and it went into remission, but it returned this year. She was due to leave Parliament at the state election in November. Her colleagues on both sides of Parliament have paid tribute to her, describing her as a rare person in politics. Jane Garrett was just 49 years old.
Yeah, it's a tragic story. Now, Sean, moving on to overseas news, and there was another big decision out of the US Supreme Court late last week, this time relating to climate change.
In a 6-3 ruling, the court found the Environmental Protection Agency doesn't have the authority to force electricity utilities to close down coal-fired power plants and shift towards renewable energy. It's being described as the biggest court case on climate change in more than a decade, while at the same time a little premature because the Biden administration hadn't actually attempted to cut carbon from power plants. The ruling was split 6-3 along the same lines as the controversial decision the previous week to overturn the Roe v. Wade abortion laws. It's another sign of the conservative shift in the Supreme Court after former President Donald Trump made 3 appointments during his 4-year term. What I found very interesting in the US last week was just how much people are ridiculing the Supreme Court. And there are fears that it actually undermines the legitimacy of the Supreme Court, some of these rulings it's done in the last couple of weeks.
Well, that's an interesting perspective, actually. I hadn't thought about how, and you would have seen it kind of firsthand being there, but it's actually calling into question their credibility.
Totally, because it is so conservative, and there's been another there's been about 4 decisions in the past fortnight which have gone along the 6-3 or 5-4 conservative vote, and it's really irritated the Democrats, or it's really irritated the left. And, you know, the problem is that if you become too one way or the other, much of the populace just don't follow you, just don't trust you.
Right. Now, Sean, how about this one? It is a story about our favourite billionaire, and I'm only calling him that because of the number of headlines that he generates for us. Elon Musk has met the Pope.
Still not sure why, Michael, but he tweeted a picture of himself and 4 of his teenage children standing alongside Pope Francis at what appeared to be a private meeting. I'd love to know what they talked about. Like Twitter, Tesla, SpaceX maybe. Apparently, whenever the Pope meets with corporate leaders, he urges them to use wealth and technology to help the poor. Mr. Musk certainly has the capacity to do that. Let's hope he follows the pontiff's lead.
Yeah, absolutely. And finally, Sean, this is an early contender for my favourite story of the week, and so I'm going to reserve it for our weekend edition coming up. It is about the secret recipe for WD-40, which is the product that I always seem to buy whenever I'm in Bunnings. No matter what I go in there to buy, I will always walk out with another can of WD-40. I've got about a dozen of them in the cupboard.
Well, that's what you love, because it hides itself, WD-40. So when you need it, you go to the cupboard and it's never there, and you think, I'm going to Bunnings. You buy WD-40, you use the new can, you then put it where you think's a sensible place to put it. And the subsequent cans, the ones that you've bought.
Yeah, I never feel tougher than when I'm using a can of WD-40 because it fixes a problem. You got a squeaky door, you can fix it with WD-40. And hey, problem solved. That's the only thing I can actually do around the house.
Well, apparently the formula is locked away in a bank vault in San Diego. Everybody knows WD-40, the blue and yellow cans, the very distinctive smell and the ability to silence any squeaking door or hinge, no matter what the problem is. Well, that's the theory. The story's in the Times because Gary Ridge, the company's CEO, is stepping down this month after 25 years in the job. The formula for the oil is written by hand, in pencil, on a notepad, and kept in a Bank of America vault. When it was moved in 2018 for the company's 65th anniversary, it was handcuffed to the CEO and escorted in an armoured car. He can now retire, knowing the recipes remained secret under his watch. What a relief.
Oh, it is. Wouldn't that be a fantastic thing to be able to say, that you're retired and nobody knows what's in WD-40? Mission accomplished.
It'd be great.
Well done, Mr. Ridge. All right, now up next is the Fear and Greed daily interview with Tim Lawless.
That's right, plenty happening in the world of property, and Tim goes through it all: house prices, auction rates, rents, the whole shebang.
Excellent. And our resident economist, Stephen Koukoulas, is back for Fear and Greed the week ahead.
I'm very excited about tomorrow's Reserve Bank board meeting is what I'd say.
Yes, I think you might be right. They're both up next in the Fear and Greed playlist on your podcast platform or at fearandgreed.com.au. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you, Michael.
It's Monday, the 4th of July, 2022. Make sure you're following the podcast. Join us online on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. And why not have a go at listening to us through your smart speaker? Just say, play the Fear and Greed podcast, and away you go. I'm Michael Thompson, and that was Fear and Greed. Have a great day.